Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for attending. This is the session on gender norms, discrimination, and intimate partner violence. Many thanks to all the panelists and participants, especially to Bilge Erten, who organized the session. So we have 4 really great papers, followed by discussion. We said we'll take about 18 minutes or so for each paper, followed by 7 minutes of discussion, and then we have about 5 minutes at the end for questions for each paper. There's a Q&A feature that you, the attendees, can use to ask questions, and we'll try to coordinate such that the speakers can get to hear your questions. It's hard to see questions when you present. So if your question isn't being answered, it'll be because it's tough for the speakers to see them. So be patient and we'll try to get to them. And so let's jump right in. The first paper is Willa Friedman, this joint work with Jean Kabore on evolution of cultural beliefs and gender of children in West Africa. So Willa, thanks for joining.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for being here. This is exciting. So as Johannes mentioned, this is joint with my really fantastic co-author, Jean Kabore, who's not on the market this year, but you can all check him out next year. He's fantastic. So anything good about this paper, you should attribute to him, and anything else, that's on me. So I'll tell you where this data comes from in a second, but by way of introduction, we're seeing that 19% of fathers in West Africa report that a man is justified in beating his wife if she goes out without telling him. 9% say it's justified if she burns the food. The same questions asked of mothers. We see 43% of mothers report that it's justified if she goes out, and 22% report that it's justified if she burns the food. 22% of mothers report experiencing some form of intimate partner violence. So one of the things that has surprised me often in looking at this is, one, just that these numbers seem to be pretty high, but also that we're seeing a lot of support or a lot of justification of intimate partner violence from women. So one question that we had in thinking about this is whether parents choose attitudes on behalf of their children, and whether one explanation for why we see such high support among women of intimate partner violence is on behalf of their sons. So what we're going to look at, so there's some previous literature that does find that indeed parents do seem to be, in some sense, choosing their beliefs on behalf of their children. So that there's evidence that daughters increase voting for pro-women policies among US politicians. There's evidence that daughters decrease support for female genital cutting in Egypt. And there's evidence that adolescent sons specifically increase father sexual activity in a sample of 37 countries. This isn't always found to be the case. There are a couple sort of exceptions to this. So Laura Zimmerman finds in India that sons don't seem to be changing women's bargaining power. Another paper in India and Bangladesh finds that daughters do increase bargaining power. So there's still some debate over this. This also speaks to this very growing literature in economics specifically about what increases IPV. As I was putting these slides together, it just got bigger and bigger and bigger, in part from reading the rest of the papers that you're going to see today. So just know this does seem to qualify as economics, as you'll see more of these. Oops, there we go. So what are we going to do? So we're going to take the reported attitudes towards domestic violence, as well as evidence of the experience of domestic violence and some questions about household decision-making. And we're going to compare those for parents of boys and parents of girls. So we've got 436,000 respondents in the demographic and health surveys for all of West Africa. This is 343,000 mothers, 93,000 fathers. This is across 12 countries, 48 surveys. We're going to take the gender of the children as plausibly random. Now, you have all probably seen papers suggesting that this isn't always the case, but we think that in this context, it's likely to be at least mostly the case. So this is a context that has had limited access to ultrasounds. We don't see a lot of reporting of sex-selective abortions from anecdotal evidence. There's very little access to IVF. At birth, we do see relatively balanced sex ratios, unlike what we see in some places where there's a lot of stories of sex-selective abortions. In most of the analysis, in all of the analysis that I'm going to show you today, we're using people's first 2 children. So even in contexts where we do see sex-selective abortions, that's happening often for later births. The final thing that we do need to mention is the differential stopping rules, where people choose whether to continue to have children based on the gender of the children that they already have, is probably the biggest threat to this. That said, in West Africa, it seems that this may be less of an issue than in some other places. So if we look at our entire sample, we see 15% have only daughters and 16% have only sons. Now, 16 is bigger than 15, but if there were big differences in whether people were stopping having children at different, based on the gender of their children, we would expect this to have a bigger gap. So we're going to take that, and then we're going to compare families with only girls compared with families with only boys among families with only one or two. So there are a bunch of robustness checks that we can show that I'm not going to show you today, where we find very similar things if we use families with only one child, all families with all girls, all families with all boys, different kinds of comparisons. They all are looking pretty similar. And then the outcomes that we're going to compare are support for intimate partner violence. So this is this question. It's going to be used in some of the other papers that you're going to see today, asking, is it justified if a man beats his wife if she X? And then there are a few different X's that get filled in. A set of empowerment questions. So what's asked is, who has the final say on something, where something is some kind of household decision making? And then a couple tangible outcomes, whether the family is polygamous and whether the parents are divorced. So I'm going to jump right in. This is really straightforward. Everything's going to be presented as figures. So here what we have is, this is reporting for mothers. This is mothers of only boys is in green, and mothers of only girls is in orange, again, limited to families of only one or two children. And so what we have in each of the sets of bars is reporting among mothers that a man is justified in beating his wife if she goes out without telling her husband, neglects the children, argues with her husband, refuses sex with her husband, or burns the food while cooking. And so these gaps, what you're seeing here, these gaps are not statistically significant. When we control for a whole bunch of things, they become even smaller and are definitely not statistically significant. And if anything, we're seeing higher reporting of acceptance of domestic violence for parents of daughters than parents of sons, okay? So exactly the same set of outcomes, but with fathers, these gaps look a little bit bigger, but fathers are less likely to report acceptance of intimate partner violence. And again, these gaps, again, not significant. If anything, we see more justification of domestic violence for parents of daughters. Then we look at experience of domestic violence. So this is something that's sort of notoriously underreported, but we have reports of emotional violence, less severe physical violence, severe physical violence, and sexual violence. And again, we see small, statistically insignificant gaps, if anything, larger reporting of experience intimate partner violence for mothers of girls relative to mothers of boys. We look at decision-making power. So we've coded this up as a 1 if the person says that either I have the final say on this, or we jointly share the final say on this, and 0 if she says that her partner has the final say. So does she have the final say on her own health care, large household purchases, daily household purchases, family visits? And again, we see these small, not statistically significant differences. And again, more reporting of this decision-making power in households where girls, sorry, not again. If anything, it's higher for the girls, parents of girls. Where we do see a large statistically significant gap, and this is consistent with all of the different specifications that we have, is in the likelihood of a polygamous marriage. So there we see that parents of daughters are mothers of daughters are more likely to be in a polygamous marriage than mothers of sons. Same thing for the fathers. We have the same set of questions about who has the final say. Again, no noticeable gaps, but we do see a difference in the likelihood of being in a polygamous marriage. So as I've mentioned, we run a couple different comparisons where we use only one kid, where we use only the gender of the first kid, where we use the fraction of the kids who are girls, and we generally see the same thing, these insignificant, pretty close to 0 differences. We also have a set of specifications where we control for a whole bunch of background characteristics that you think might matter. And again, we see very small gaps. So one question we have I got to be honest, I came into this definitely not expecting to see this. I thought, of course, we're going to have these gaps, and here's all the analysis that we're going to do to explain where these gaps come from. Not what we found. So now we're trying to figure out why there's no gap. Is there really truly no gap? So one question is this something about polygamy? So this is a context in which if a woman has a daughter, we see that she's more likely to end up in a polygamous marriage. Maybe there's a feeling of being in a more precarious position as a result of having that daughter. And so the mother of the daughter is willing to accept less and the husband's perhaps accepting more. So we thought, great, we'll compare places with and without polygamy. But the problem is, in this context, every place has polygamy. So among the countries that we're using, the country with the lowest fraction of women in polygamous marriages is Liberia with 24%, which is still a pretty high percent. And to be clear, this polygamous variable is at the moment your husband has multiple wives. So some of those that we're categorizing as monogamous are actually just not yet polygamous. The husband hasn't yet taken a second wife. In case you thought maybe this was going to work out. So it's also not just Muslims. If we look only at non-Muslims, Senegal has the lowest fraction polygamous, which is still 22%. If we look, maybe you think it's Muslims and other religions. If we take only self-reported Christians, Senegal has the lowest fraction polygamy, which is still 20%. So there's not really a subset that we can find where polygamy is not a possibility, where somebody might not be in this precarious position after having daughters. Still, what we're going to do is we're going to split the sample with above median polygamy and below median polygamy as some evidence of whether this is, putting somebody in a different position. We're going to define areas as the largest administrative region across urban-rural status. And so here we've got just the polygamy rates for all of these different areas. So you'll see the very lowest one is just below 10%, and it's a very, very small group. They go up to above 60%. So what I'm going to show you now in the right, this is also the attitudes towards IPV. So on the right, we've got the same thing that I've showed you before. And then on the left and in the middle, we've got this only for places with above 30%, 37% polygamy. And in the middle, we've got only places with below 37% polygamy. As you see, we're seeing exactly the same thing. So we do see differences in beliefs or attitudes in the high polygamy places and the low polygamy places, but we don't see that the gap grows or changes in places with lower rates of polygamy. We see the same thing when we look at fathers. I don't actually know how many minutes I have left. To be honest, forgot to check the time.
Sorry, I was on mute. 10.
10. Okay, great. I think I might finish early, actually. So one question is it just that this is a weird question? So in some ways, I don't think I need to justify this question as much to this audience because I know that a lot of you have used this question before, but I do think it's probably still worth considering what this question is really asking. So we did something just sort of out of curiosity, thinking about this question and thinking about these gender attitudes as a function of the gender of somebody's children. And so what we did was we took exactly the same questions along with another set of questions, and we asked that in the US. So we did this in an online survey. And I'm going to show you just those results as evidence that maybe this question is meaningful in some way. So we asked the same set of questions about justification of intimate partner violence, of fathers and mothers, of sons and daughters, again, in this online survey in the US. So is a man justified in beating his wife if she goes out without telling her husband, neglects the children, argues with her husband, refuses sex with her husband, burns food while cooking? So in this US sample, now we see very large gaps. And so this is the same question that's been used in other places, and some people have found different gaps. So there may be something that's particular about West Africa. Great. So putting this all together, we're comparing gender-related attitudes and the experience of intimate partner violence of parents of boys and parents of girls in West Africa. We find small or no significant difference. This is surprising to us given the previous findings. And if anything, we're seeing more acceptance of violence among parents of daughters. So I may not have timed that well, so I think we have a little extra time, but I would love to hear some questions. So I'm going to stop sharing. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Willa. So we can go straight to the discussion, and then we'll just have more time for questions afterwards. So Hani, if you want to take over.
Okay. Thanks, Willa. This was a fun paper to read, also because I happened to be looking at a kind of a related question, so it helped me think about the literature and kind of see what's going on in other countries. So let me just summarize really quickly. The main question in the paper is whether having girls change the attitudes of parents towards IPV, and not just mothers, but also fathers, which I think is important. And then the paper tries to think a little bit about the mechanisms of why the gender of the child might matter, and how it can change the gender attitudes towards daughters or sons. They combined data from 12 different countries in West Africa. And surprisingly, I have to say, I was also surprised. The results don't indicate that the sex of the children impacts parents' attitudes towards IPV or other measures of, let's say, bargaining. There is some evidence that mothers with one or two daughters are more likely to be in polygamous marriages compared to mothers with two or more sons, which, as I will discuss in a minute, we might, it's unclear a little bit how to interpret what polygamy means in this context. So in terms of the mechanism, the paper really highlights two main mechanisms through which this can operate. One is that parents can empathize with their daughters, their mothers or fathers, and care more about their well-being, and essentially making them less supportive, let's say, or of IPV. It's also possible that daughters can change the status of the mother. In one context, it can lower the status of mothers. But unlike, the paper really thinks that that should lead to worse attitudes towards IPV. I'm going to argue that theoretically it's unclear. I don't think we know whether lowering the status of women might actually reinforce gender attitudes, or might make, let's say, mothers think, oh, this is not great. I don't want my daughter to feel this way. So there's kind of an interaction between the first and the second mechanism. The third one, which I think is missing a little bit in the discussion, is the fact that there could be also differential allocation of resources across daughters and sons, which could potentially, again, either reinforce kind of pre-existing gender attitudes or change them based on how mothers see or allocate, or see their husbands allocate resources towards their children. And finally, like Willa was mentioning, family size here is a big deal. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, because it's possible that family size on its own has kind of a direct effect on IPV, regardless of, let's say, the gender of the first child or something like that. And I'm sure, if I think more carefully, we can probably list more mechanisms, and obviously there's an interaction between all of them, so none of them is operating separately. But I think, utilizing the DHS a little bit more to try and tease out some of these things could be pretty helpful. So let me think about the sample a little bit. I'm a little bit confused about the samples that the authors decided to choose by focusing essentially on families with one or two daughters or one or two sons. I can see the rationale on the one hand. On the other hand, you're asking those questions about attitudes when children are relatively young, I'm assuming, for these families, because most families in West Africa, I'm guessing, have more than two children. And so it will be interesting to see, kind of like intentions about having more children. And just as a simple balance test, it would be, I know that we think that the gender of the child is exogenous in these contexts, but it'll be helpful to show some balance tests across families to essentially at least compare them on observables. My preferred sample, if I was writing this paper, would be to focus on the sex of the first child, because that seems to be, I think there's a consensus that, without any sophisticated technology, I think that technology exists already, but assuming that we don't have access to technology that helps us choose the sex of the child, I think that's probably the most exogenous thing you're going to have, also because it doesn't limit or constrain the family, like the realized family size down the road, especially if we focus on families that completed their fertility. But the paper does a really good job at thinking about a lot of different samples, but maybe kind of thinking a little bit through about the advantages and disadvantages of each of them and which one should be in the main analysis versus, let's say, in the appendix would be, I think, would be helpful. In the empirical specification, so I didn't see, so I think maybe Willa, maybe you've tried this already, without showing it in the paper. But, I would like to see specifications that don't control for potentially endogenous outcomes like, number of kids, spacing, marital status, and ultimately really the share of girls in the families, which I think might be the most important thing we want to think about. Like, how many girls do you have? Maybe if families have 2 girls out of 7, that's not as doesn't really change attitudes compared to having like 4 girls out of 7 or something like that. So I was wondering if you just choose the share of girls rather than, although that's clearly not exogenous, whether that actually produces similar results or no differences. And I bet that that's something that does vary the sex of the first child. And finally, I was also thinking a little bit about this idea that the evolution of attitudes towards girls could change as girls age. So it's possible that parents have some attitudes towards their children when they're 2 or 3 years old. But as girls age, as they go to school, maybe people update their beliefs about their children. And that's how the evolution of attitudes towards, let's say, IPV or other measures of bargaining happen. It's unclear how to do it in this context because you don't really have a panel of data where you can observe families with the same questions when the children are young or old. But maybe thinking around how, for example, how controlling for the distribution of the ages of the kids in the family changes these questions, or how does the comparison across the age distribution of the children might help us think a little bit about that evolution that parents might go through. Just a few more suggestions. Obviously, family size is endogenous, but maybe you could think about completed family size, not based on the actual number of kids, but maybe somehow cut it, for example, by some biological age for women that, after which they can't really have more children as completed fertility, and maybe try to think about that sample. Thinking about polygamy as lowering the status of women, I live in the Middle East, so I know that that's true here. Typically, at least that's how we think about it. But it struck me as a little bit inconsistent that on the one hand, we see differences in polygamy, and on the other hand, there's really not many differences in what we typically think of as measures of bargaining. So like if really we have a consistent story that the status of the mother is lowered, then maybe we should also see her bargaining power also changes, or her experience of IPV also changes. And it's also, I just would dig a little bit into these results about polygamy, because if I'm not mistaken, in the appendix, when we look at the sample of the families where only the sex of the first child is used as the main variation, I don't think there are differences in polygamy. So I would just kind of wonder, is that something that is just specific for the sample that you're using, or something that's more generalizable? And about the family sizes and the fact that, you see the similar stopping rules for children with 2 sons or 2 daughters, when I looked at evidence from Nigeria, and this is I just happened by just completely randomly, like I didn't even know that this is what your paper is about. I was looking at data from the DHS in Nigeria, and there is a big difference in the number of children based on the sex of the first child. So I would just maybe try to understand whether this similar stopping rule is some sort of like weird, happenstance once you aggregate all the data, or whether it actually true for every country separately. And finally, if we're thinking about changes in attitudes, what about actual investments in children? I know these papers have been written, so you're probably not going to be the first person to write this paper, but it'll be interesting to see, do we see if attitudes are changing to the worse, for example, or not changing, then we should also see like not much happening in terms of investments in children. And finally, there are two papers that are missing from your citations. Hopefully you know about them because I think they're really related and pretty cool papers. One by Giulia Ozier and co-authors about the role of sisters in developing the human capital of the siblings. And there's a really neat paper by Tom Vogel in the QJE looking at kind of the effect of sisters on like the marriage market of their sisters essentially. And both of them, I think, do a really good job trying to explain how they think about the variation based on the sex of the child. At least they're helping me in what I'm thinking about to think kind of thoroughly about that. Otherwise, I know the paper is still in early stages, but I'm super excited to see the second version and see where it goes. And thank you so much for letting me discuss it and read it.
Great, thank you, Hani. So we have a few minutes for questions, and Willa, you're free to run that as you please if you want to respond briefly, or Cecilia, Conrad asked the question in the Q&A.
Thanks so much for that. That was awesome. Consistent with my initial claim that all of the good things were from Jean and everything else is from me. I should clarify, Jean was the one who thought that we should use the specifications that you're suggesting should be the main ones of the gender of the first child and then the fraction female in the full sample. So to be clear, we do see exactly the same things with those specifications, but that's good to hear that we should make those more prominent. Cecilia's question, I once heard someone suggest variations across polygamy based on types of crops farmed. Yeah, that's an interesting idea to come up with some sort of other measures. So the thing that I think is difficult is, let's say you're in a place with, one reason that I'm actually disliking the polygamy split is, let's say you're in a place where it's just assumed everybody's going to be polygamous, then having a daughter maybe doesn't put you in as much of a precarious position. Like, you know that if you're a woman and you have a daughter, you know that your husband's going to take another wife. It really doesn't matter the gender of the child. So maybe that actually doesn't make you any more precarious. It's in places where there's some chance that it might not happen. And so the ideal counterfactual would be to have a place where there's none of it. And I think that's what we don't seem to have is an area in this larger area where we have none. But anyway, if others have questions, I'm here and happy to answer any of the questions. That would be fun. But these were all really great suggestions, Hani. I really appreciate it. Thanks. Oh, thanks, Shreya. That's a great idea. So we can see the timing of marriage and we can see the timing of the children. And so we could see the timing of the marriage to the other wives in at least a lot of the context. And so, yeah, so we could sort of see this relationship between the gender of the child. So Hani's point of, if you look at people with only one son or one daughter, we don't see a huge difference. They may not have had the time yet to get that first wife, but to get the second wife. And so, but we can check that based on the timing of the second births using the full sample of people and the timing of their becoming polygamous. Yeah, great idea.
Great. If there aren't other questions, thank you again, Willa and Hani, and let's move to the next paper. That's by Giulia Mattina and Olga Shemyakina, presented by Olga, and it's titled Conflicts, Exposure in Childhood and Adolescence and Acceptance of Domestic Violence in Adulthood. So Olga, please.
All right. Thank you for coming to our presentation. Once again, it's paper with Giulia Mattina, and looking good. She's responsible for all mistakes of mine. So here we look at the impact of conflict in early childhood on attitudes towards domestic violence. So the paper is closely related to the paper by Willa and Jean. So they use the same questions, but they ask questions differently. I mean, it's a totally different question. So what we focus on the effect of exposure to armed conflict in childhood and adolescence on attitudes toward domestic violence. So the prior research on the topic suggests that the impact of conflict on domestic violence could be ambiguous. For example, exposure to more violence overall and changes in marriage market sex ratios may lead to poorer prospects for women, and as a result, increased domestic violence and also increased tolerance towards abuse. On another side, many women during the conflict impacted years, they enter the labor market to substitute for the income loss from their partners, and they continue working. So there could be more egalitarian distribution of income, and as a result, acceptance of domestic violence may decrease. I mean, the same actually channel between work and increased amount of income contributed by the woman towards the household can also lead actually to an increase of domestic violence conditioned on the male engagement in the labor market backlash. And also, if you have increase in pro-social attitudes following conflict, it may decrease support for violent behavior, as suggested by some studies. So it is a pervasive issue worldwide. 30% of ever partnered women impacted by domestic violence, and when domestic violence is costly. For example, results from the United States estimates that assault during pregnancy can cost over $55,000. Putting in numbers, and the results are immeasurable in other ways. So another motivation is that greater acceptance may encourage abuse and discourage reporting. So we may not see as much reporting of violence. And we already see it in the data, right? We have been seeing it. And the effect of policies that encourage women's autonomy on domestic violence may depend on local levels of acceptance. So there has been actually not much research and looked at the factors that drive acceptance of domestic violence. And there are studies also from the literature on the formation of attitudes in early childhood and basically psychology related to early childhood, and suggest that childhood and adolescence are critical period for formation of beliefs and attitudes that can persist during your childhood, adulthood. And I mean, there is a differences in how these attitudes are formed. For younger individuals, like for very young children, it is experienced by their caregivers that matters a lot because they can't control their own environment. For older children, they have more agency and maybe less susceptible to violence. So we look at geocoded data from household surveys, like the same DHS that Willa just mentioned. And we have 320,000 women, and there are also about 140,000 men interviewed in 23 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We look at variation in exposure to conflict across birth cohorts and geographically across survey clusters. So what we find is that exposure in early childhood increases acceptance of domestic violence, and the most critical age is actually early childhood, when we are looking at trying to break down the different ages. So, so we have several contributions suggesting that the shocks in childhood shape acceptance of domestic violence, suggesting that actually targeting women who were exposed to early childhood may help later on. And we are secondly contributing by looking at the specific and detailed age categories by when those women were exposed to childhood to kind of violence in their neighborhood. So it's not the direct violence that we're talking about, it's the violence in the neighborhood that they experience. So we look at the acceptance of domestic violence, and attitudes of men and women, and we focus on the attitudes of women. And we combine it with UCDB Prio data set on conflict, which is the use of armed force between two parties, or which at least one of a government state results in at least 25 battle-related deaths. And we look at minor and major conflict. Traditionally, the outcome variables, if wife beating is justified in a number of situations, and if a wife goes out without telling her husband, neglects her children, argues with her husband, refuses sex, and burns the food. And we use two setups. One is a 5 dummy variables that is equal to 1 if an individual responded that wife beating is justified in a specific situation, and a standardized scale, which is comprised from all attitudes. So for conflict exposure, we use standard procedure in the kind of conflict literature. We create a circle buffer around each conflict event using the latitude, longitude, and radius, and we use 50-kilometer intervals. And the geographic location of a conflict event captures the midpoint of all battles associated with conflict event. And having 50 kilometers intervals allows us to kind of to account for slight movement in the DHS cluster, which is not, which changes by 2 kilometers, 2 to about 2 kilometers. We make the buffers with survey clusters and using a spatial joint. And the key independent variable is a binary indicator if a survey cluster was affected by conflict, was an individual, was of a certain age. For example, age 0 to 9. So here are our study areas. There are many more countries exposed to conflict, but those are the study areas where you have attitudes data and the conflict data at the same time that we can use. There is OLAS regression where the Y is our main outcome variable, or like the attitudes of an individual, and the conflict is the main conflict exposure during specific time in one's childhood or adolescence is the main outcome. Sorry, the main driving factor. So here in table 3, it's our basic table. Baseline table, we look at the exposure to conflict by any conflict, and then they separate it into minor and major conflict. And in column 3, we use only war, and we compare all individuals who exposed but to war, which is like more than 1,000 deaths per conflict here, compared to minor conflict exposure and no exposure at all. And those are individuals who are exposed to conflict between ages 0 to 9. They are more likely, statistically significantly more likely to say, yes, they are more tolerant of domestic violence attitudes. So in those figures 2A and 2B, kind of look at ages, different ages when an individual was exposed to the first war, because Africa is the home of too many conflicts, unfortunately. And we can see here that age at first war, if you look at the second graph, between 0 to 5 years old is one of statistically significant coefficient that we have. So like driving, that's the age that drives the results of a graph on the left. So in figure 2C, we separated even further into subcategories, and we observe that age 0 to 2 appears to be driving factor, not the ages when an individual is older. So in table 4, we look at the exposure to minor conflict and the war by broader age categories, 4 different subcategories of index of attitudes if wife goes out without telling husband. And we say that exposure to war matters. It increases people saying that, yes, this behavior shouldn't be tolerated. For last three categories, wife beating is justified if she argues, if uses to have sex with him, burns for food. When we categorize wage into like even narrower categories, we see that the first three variables come statistically significant again for the younger age group, 0 to 5. So what mechanism may be driving those results? We looked at three of them, and women's education and husband's education, men's education, differences in age and education between wives and husbands, and female age at first marriage. So what we find here, the first table looks at educational attainment by women and men, and those are not a matched samples. So like this women not matched to their husband, but those are husbands in data set. So we see that both men and women, when they're exposed to conflict between age 0 to 19 or age 0 to 9, we have a significant decline in their education. And the column 3 and column 6 show us that the decline in education is not linear, because it kind of early age exposure has a significantly greater impact on one's education, women in particular. And later, if you're exposed to conflict in both periods, it declines. And table 7 shows us the differences in education and age between husbands and wife. And here we see actually very little impacts, significant impacts, except of form 1. So suggesting that possibly that conflict decrease both education of men and women during that period of time. So it didn't lead to women getting married to more educated men or older men, but they're married to the similar men as they used to marry before. But basically, both of them suffer from reduced education due to conflict, as the previous table suggests. And this table looks also at the age subcategories and says, finds that there is some difference in education, maybe possibly explained between ages 11 to 15. Okay. So table 9, we look at whether women were more likely to get married if they were exposed to conflict during their formative years. And exposure to minor conflict appears to have reduced chances that women married before age 20. While if they're exposed to the war, it appears that they have been, that's an increased chance for women to get married earlier. So, and earlier marriage typically reduces agency within a household because women, when they get married earlier, they're not completing their education, and they're still children, they're still forming their attitudes and their view on the world, so they're more easily to be controlled. So in here, we're more susceptible to saying that violence in marriage for particular behavior is acceptable. Okay. And this is again looking at the subcategories, and subcategories suggest that earlier exposure seems to have a great impact on being married at early age. So we also look at the difference between individuals by separating them by their migration status using DHS data, which is not very great for migration. And we'll look also at the sample, because not all countries, they have data on migration, meaning that the respondent always lived in the community of current residents. So, so the column 1 shows us migration samples. So, and the results are similar to what we already seen. Age at, the earlier you're exposed to conflict and major conflict, has a significant impact on you being more responsive to attitudes towards domestic violence. And it appears that for migrants, the results are a little bit greater. So, sorry, non-migrants are a little bit more likely to respond that they are agreeing the statements that wife is to be punished for certain behaviors during the marriage. And so, yeah, and this is again, like we see that exposure at first war between 0 to 2, age 0 to 2 is the most significant. So let's define the sort of mechanisms that decrease in education, possibly a driving factor for acceptance of domestic violence attitudes for greater support. Female age at first marriage is slightly lower, so which probably also leads to greater support for attitude towards domestic violence. And partners seem to be highly matched by age and education, suggesting that it doesn't appear to be a shift between who those women marry, but like for both of them, education and education declines. So basically our main findings are that decrease in education due to conflict appears to be a potential driving channel through which conflict has impacted domestic violence. Exposure during very early age matters, and matters more than exposure later on. And we suggest that it's probably the lower bound of the actual prevalence of attitudes towards domestic violence in sub-Saharan Africa. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to comments.
Great, thank you, Olga. So the discussion.
Hello. It's me again. So great, I'm going to discuss this really awesome paper. So I had a great time reading this, and I'll tell you why in a second. So just as a summary, these guys show that exposure to civil conflict as a youth increases acceptance of domestic violence for men and for women, and the likelihood of experiencing domestic violence for women also goes up. This is especially true for exposure during childhood, and within that, especially true for exposure during the earliest years of childhood. They also show evidence that this is likely going partly through the channel of selection of spouses, as well as through education. So this is a really consistent result. They have large and significant effects on a range of outcomes. It's also broadly consistent with the findings in an earlier draft. Now, how do I know this? I realized after having read through this paper this time that I had previously been a discussant on this paper. So let me just summarize all the suggestions that I made here, yada, yada, yada. They've done all of that. It's fantastic. And they seem to be getting exactly the same thing that they were getting at the time. Even including results that they're not showing you here, just to try to be more concise. And so it's even consistent with the old stuff. So this is giving me a strong, even stronger feeling that these results are fantastically credible. I was especially happy to see an exploration of some of the changes in marriage markets and mechanisms like education that were inspired by these authors' previous research. So that was wonderful to see. So I think this paper is great. I have some open questions, some of which I think can't really be answered with this, but I wanted to open it up in part because these are questions that I think I kind of have for this audience, and maybe there are ways, small ways that can these guys could get at them with the analysis that they're doing. So I think there's often this question of what's a mechanism and what is just something that also changed. So specifically with the example of lower educational attainment. So they see experiencing violence at a young age lowers educational attainment. There's previous research, including by some people here, that lower educational attainment decreases increases acceptance of intimate partner violence. But can we say how much of the channel is through that? And I'm particularly curious about this because a lot of the motivation for this paper, and I think a lot of the reason why a lot of us are interested in these questions of violence begetting violence, is that there's some other channel, that there's something about the experience of violence and knowing that that violence is happening, not just the fact that violence messes up everything else in your life, like you get less schooling and that causes this other outcome. And so it would be interesting to do a little bit more with the magnitudes. So I think that showing the ages at which these things matter is suggestive that the education channel probably is a likely channel, but it might be interesting to see if, are you getting magnitudes that are really just much bigger than you would be getting if it were just going through education? And that might be suggestive that part of the channel is still that channel of there's something psychological about the experience of living through violence. And I think that some of what you have in this paper, so this would not be additional analysis, it would just be sort of reinterpreting some of these magnitudes that you have in the paper. You could already say something, but I acknowledge that it's a little bit, this would be a little bit hand wavy and suggestive. So I understand why maybe you've chosen not to keep it in here, or not to put it in here yet. And then the other question is, and this is just a question that has sort of become an obsession of mine, but what does this variable of acceptance of IPV mean? And so how do we interpret it? And I know that both of you have used this before in previous research, and it seems to often mean different things. So one of the things that it sometimes means is it's a proxy for the experience of domestic violence. So these questions are asked and people are more likely to give their answers about how they feel about intimate partner violence than to really admit things necessarily about their own experience. So it's used as a proxy to reflect actual experience. And then it's also used to say, well, there's something, the attitudes, the feelings about violence have changed, and that could have then subsequent, that could change the experience of violence for somebody else. So my feelings about violence have changed, I'm more likely to engage in this. And I think that your work, both what's in this paper itself and then the work of both of you guys in separate papers, is really convincing me that the true answer is that it's both, which is annoying in some sense from a causal identification standpoint. But I think it's really important that we kind of, one, acknowledge that it's both, and two, maybe see how much we can go further in sort of teasing those apart whenever possible. Anyway, I really enjoyed this paper. I think it's done. So congratulations on it being done. These are really open questions for future work. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Willa. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. So Olga, you should feel free to either respond to Willa and or take questions from the Q&A. One thing that Nina made me aware of is that the questions in the Q&A are only visible to us on the panel, so please read them out before you answer them, because otherwise the attendees won't be able to see them.
So the questions on Q&A, I think, are for Willa.
Yeah, those are still from the previous paper. There aren't any new ones yet.
Right, there are no new ones. Yeah, I appreciate Willa's discussion of this paper. Yes, she already probably discussed this paper a while ago because we had so many reiterations of the violence paper, and we did do before use the data on experiences of domestic violence as well, and we tied it together, but now I can't recall the reason why we decided to drop this result. So yeah, and I understand the question that coming from that it appears to be that children are really, I mean, from the age categories, we see that individuals seem to be more likely to respond that they're accepting violence if there is exposure to it during age 0 to 2, while and education could occur concurrently, right? Impacts on education could occur concurrently. You don't know exactly if it's a driving mechanism. It may be suggesting that, we're trying to do the best that we can given the data that we have. Okay. Yeah, thank you. And if someone has more questions later, yeah, well, I'll take it later. So I'll let other presenters to take the floor so we have more time.
Yeah, that sounds good. So unless there are any Q&As, any questions in the chat, which there aren't, let's move on. Great. So the next paper is by Bilge, Erten, and Pinar, Keskin, and it's called Trade-offs: The Impact of WTO Accession on Intimate Partner Violence in Cambodia. So Bilge, please.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Thank you for this great session. And this paper, we are focusing on the effects of a WTO accession, but it's essentially a trade liberalization episode in Cambodia on intimate partner violence. And we are focusing on the trade-offs that creates for women's risk of domestic violence. This joint work with Pinar Keskin from Wellesley College. So let me motivate this research by saying that many developing countries have experienced episodes of trade liberalization across past 3 decades, perhaps more. And there is lots of evidence suggesting that greater exposure to import competition across labor market outcomes generally creates a deterioration in these outcomes. In particular, many studies find that formal paid employment declines in regions of the country where there is greater exposure to foreign competition, especially if the domestic industries are not highly competitive in the world market. There's also recent evidence that shows that these trade-induced job losses are in some cases leading to increases in violent crime. And in the case of Mexico, Mills et al. Has a paper showing that that leads to more crime in regions of Mexico with greater exposure to import competition from China by lowering the opportunity cost of criminal employment. In case of Brazil, Rafael Dix Carneiro and co-authors have a paper showing also in addition to this first channel, also that it can also reduce public goods provision by reducing taxable income in the local economy, and also leading to increases in income inequality. So we also know that these exposure to these trade shocks can also vary employment outcomes by gender. There is evidence showing that that is the case in Mexico and Brazil, but we know very little about whether these differential gender-specific employment shocks created by trade liberalization can also have violent consequences on for women's exposure to violence within the household. So in this study, we're going to examine how trade-induced employment changes in Cambodia affects IPV. And we are going to follow the trade literature, starting with Topolova and many other studies that explore these regional variation in import competition stemming from large-scale import tariff reductions. And we are going to focus Cambodia's WTO accession that happened in 2004. And we are going to essentially focus on how these differential exposure across regions affected men's versus women's employment and earnings outcomes differentially in Cambodia. And then we're going to think about how then those differential effects can create changes in intimate partner violence. So that is the second part that is distinct from much of the prior work, except for a recent paper by Chong and Velasquez that examined the effects of trade liberalization in Peru on IPV in the 2000s. And actually their results are ours, and ours are extremely similar in some dimensions. So I'm going to discuss that a little bit towards the end. So we all know that domestic violence remains a very important social, economic, and public health problem. And women in violent relationships are more likely to report a host of mental health issues, as well as absence from work, productivity shocks, sexually transmitted diseases, and so on. And women, children also born and raised in such households also have a number of worse outcomes, including lower birth weights, lower IQ, and delays in development. These children also can have actually negative spillover effects on their peers across a number of behavioral dimensions. Now, we can think about how the trade-induced employment changes can affect IPV through different channels. So in general, we think about economic empowerment of women as a way of preventing or reducing IPV. And for that, we generally have bargaining theories in mind. Here, narrowing the gender employment gap generally increases the bargaining power of women, and by increasing her outside options and therefore reducing her exposure to domestic violence. So there's evidence of this in the US by Iser and in the UK by Underberg. But there's a second set of theories that actually says the opposite can happen. By reducing the gender employment gap, can actually increase the male partner's incentives to use violence or threats of violence as an instrument to either extract resources from women or to try to control decision-making power within the household. And in some cases, it could also be a means of forcing women to work longer hours. So we seem to find some evidence of that in this paper, and we'll talk more about that. In addition, trade shocks can have the opposite effect, whereby they can widen the gender employment gap, which would actually result in the opposite effects through the same channels. So as a preview of our results, we find that men in districts facing larger tariff reductions experience a significant decline in employment, whereas women in these harder hit districts actually increase their entry into the workforce, suggesting an added worker effect to compensate for the loss in household income. We also find that this increase in employment actually triggers backlash effects by increasing intimate partner violence across many dimensions, including physical, sexual, and some the additional injuries that women experience. Looking at alternative mechanisms, we find no changes in marriage rates, fertility, psychological distress, or sort of husband's behavioral indicators like jealousy. And in general, we think that this is consistent with this second set of theories of instrumental violence, which predict the use of violence by men as an instrument for controlling household decision-making and or appropriating resources from women. So just a very brief background on Cambodia's trade liberalization. So Cambodia had a very devastating civil war from 1968 to 1975. And then in the post-conflict period, the government had a goal of eradicating hunger. It was a very devastating war. And one of the policies they pursued was to abolish the state monopoly on foreign trade and also encouraged private firms to engage in foreign trade, in particular focusing on the textile sector. And in 1993, the Kingdom of Cambodia is established, and a new government made international trade engagement a priority. And finally, in 2004, Cambodia became the first least developed country to join WTO, along with Nepal. And with these commitments, they had a rapid tariff cut. So you see here from 2001 to 2014, there was a 10 percentage point tariff cut in ad valorem tariffs from about 18 percentage point to 8. And in addition to these overall tariff changes, I think what's also more interesting and important is that these tariff changes actually varied strongly across industries. So the industries such as apparel, beverages, food products, and other textiles, which had a very high tariff rate, close to 40% in some cases, had a huge cut in the tariffs, whereas the industries that had low tariffs to begin with, they had smaller tariff cuts. And we don't see a lot of off-diagonal industries And what we do is that we are going to take these initial industry composition at each district of Cambodia using these various industrial composition at the initial level. And we are going to then weight that, we're going to interact that with the changes in tariffs in these industries over time. And this is usually seen as evidence that the industries that were initially very protected did not actually have a lot of power to lobby against tariff cuts. And so we think this was mostly a change driven by the government policy, and there wasn't a lot of local lobbying power from the industries. So for the identification strategy, we are going to generate a district level measure, as I said, by combining this industry level variation in tariffs and the district level variation in industrial composition at the baseline, which is going to be 1998. And this will be a difference in differences. We're going to compare districts characterized with large tariff cuts versus small tariff cuts, conditional loan, district, and year fixed effects. And we're going to also control for district specific linear trends. We also control for time varying individual characteristics. So more specifically, so we're going to use these initial employment shares of the traded sectors. We're going to have 40 sectors, and we're going to interact that with the tariffs that these industries, tariff rates that these industries faced. And we have 160 districts. So this is going to give us a nice variation across districts about how these exposure to import competition changed over time. And this is the primary specification where we are regressing the district tariff on individual outcomes. And we're going to estimate this with OLS. We control for, as I said, individual characteristics such as the age, education, and rural indicator. And as I said, we have district fixed effects, time fixed effects, and district specific linear trends that absorb a lot of these unobservable trajectories that districts faced over time. So we use a number of data sources for this study. We use the census of Cambodia from 1998 to 2008. And we also have demographic and health surveys for 3 rounds. We have socioeconomic surveys of 4 rounds. And we are going to use the trains database to get the industrial level tariffs. Okay, so very quickly, if we want to preview the results for in districts that face the reduction, let's say the average district that faced about 10 percentage point reduction in district tariffs, men's employment declined by about 0.4 percentage points. And we see that most of these men left the labor force. They became not in the labor force. And for women, the opposite occurred, where women actually entered the labor force more. And this came mostly from not being in the labor force before. And they also sought more work. So some of them also increased their unemployment. And in terms of by sector and types of employment, we see that actually for both men and women, paid employment declined across all sectors. But women increased their employment, particularly in the unpaid category, where they work as an unpaid worker in the family farm mostly. So you see that agriculture is very high, but also some in just family enterprises. And also self-employment also increased. In case of men, you see that those categories also increased, but not enough to offset the decline in paid employment. For earnings, I won't get into detail, but there's a decline for both men and women, slightly bigger decline for men, because they lose more paid employment. In terms of intimate partner violence, using DHS data, we see the same increases in women's employment, but also increases in physical violence, injuries, sexual violence, and a decline in decision-making index, no significant change in psychological violence. For alternative channels, we don't find any significant changes in marital status or having children, number of children. We also importantly don't find any effects on psychological problems. So if men, for example, were very upset because they became unemployed, we think we might see something here, because this question was broadly asked as sort of, have you experienced any upsetting events, but also sort of mental and emotional problems. And we don't find any significant changes for men or for women. And we also don't find that, for example, men become more jealous when women start to work more, or that they, accuse the women of being unfaithful. We just don't find evidence of these other alternative channels. We also looked at pre-trans for employment. We don't find much evidence. We also don't find much evidence of inter-regional migration. We also did some robustness checks, like excluding industries with highest tariff declines or lowest tariff declines, and also excluding off-diagonal industries, and these results seem to be robust. And just to conclude, we present one of the first, let's say, evidence on the effects of trade liberalization on IPV, and we find that men's employment declines in this case, whereas women try to compensate by increasing their entry into workforce. And this triggers these backlash effects from men, which could be mostly in terms of trying to control women's, participation into unpaid work within the agricultural farm. And this is essentially constant with men using violence as an instrument for extracting resources from women, in this case, mostly in terms of women's time engaged in unpaid agriculture. So that is the paper. We think this is important because if we ignore such potentially, and the other paper on Peru also finds backlash effects. Also, they find, again, that men are more, suffer more from the trade shock, and they also find an increase in IPV through this backlash effects. So we think this is important because we generally think trade liberalization might create benefits, but in this case, the benefits are not that obvious if there are such large backlash effects. Thank you. And I look forward to comments.
Great, thank you, Bilge. So next we have comments by Casey. Casey, please.
All right, everything looks good there?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, very good. So I'll be doing this discussion today. This is one of the tough ones because in some very good news for Bilge and Pinar, they've gotten a revise and resubmit on this paper at a very good journal. But that of course makes my job harder, in that one, this is a very polished paper to have gotten to that point. So I'm not gonna have a lot of things to pick at. And then also, obviously they should be listening to referees and not to what I say. So I think I'll focus my comments in a minute on some of the sort of more thematic issues and maybe thinking about things that might be useful for their ongoing work and that of others here in this session. I say here that it's revised and resubmitted, a great journal, and that's appropriate because this is an extremely well-written paper with a strong identification strategy and careful data work and an important question. So it has all of the things that merit that kind of placement. I should say that in the version I got, I think it's a short paper format. It has 5 main exhibits and seems to be of about that length, and it's at a journal that accepts those short papers. And I think this is a great example of the kind of paper that is great for that format. So, you know, the identification strategy they have where you use some sort of trade policy as a way to identify shocks to labor market outcomes, that is pretty well established at this point. So they can rely on that. They don't have to spend a ton of time trying to validate that strategy or, you know, consider 100 different threats to it. But they've taken that strategy and applied it to a new and important question. So I'm glad that's available to them. And if you're looking for an example of a short paper, I think this is a great one. So if I go now to my thoughts that are sort of more about talking about the results in the paper or the way that they're framed, you know, one comment I have is about the potential that one mechanism for the results is that women are changing their reporting of their experiences with intimate partner violence. And this is something that they mention in the paper. They do one kind of check to try to investigate this, in which they compare the results for the questions that ask about your experience with violence to the ones that actually ask about injuries. And because those are similar, they say that since the latter is a more objective measure, perhaps this is not evidence of a difference in reporting. I didn't find that really convincing as a way to rule out reporting as a potential mechanism. You know, what could be happening here is that as women get more power in the household or they have better outside options, for example, they're more likely to report on the survey their experience. And I should say that I don't think this in any way undermines the results of the paper. It just affects the interpretation. And I would like to see that possibility a little more, emphasized a little more in the paper and maybe not dismissed quite to the extent that I think it is. I'm not quite sure that the check supports it to that degree. The bigger thing I want to talk about here, you know, and this is something that I see across so many of these papers, which is, you know, we go through the different channels by which these labor market shocks, these gender-specific labor market changes might affect people's experience with violence and domestic violence in particular, but also things like crime. You know, and I say that there's a tendency to ascribe economic motives, and economics is in quotes because I'm an economist who studies, you know, family and demography and all kinds of things. So all of that is economics to me. But what I mean here is, you know, very specific economic, you know, terms like changes in bargaining power or your outside options or tools for extracting resources. These are all things that are mentioned within this paper as potential channels. And I think those are all very much on the table as potential channels. But, you know, what I don't see is just that these guys might be mad, right? And it calls to mind many other cases where when there's some kind of a shift in the social structure or in institutions that have long advantaged one population, that when those advantages start to erode, they get mad and they act out in all kinds of different ways, right? So it made me think, for example, of the work on the experience of Black Americans with lynching. So I mentioned here, you know, some of the authors in that literature, Lisa Cook, Trevon Logan, John Parman, Sandy Darity, and some others. This quote that's from the Cook, Logan, and Parman paper in 2018, I think is a really succinct way to put the concern. You know, when they're talking about lynchings, and I think there are parallels here, they say they are responses to the perception of a deterioration of white status and used to reinforce a racial hierarchy. So I think you could say that, you know, potentially domestic violence is reactive as a response to the perception of a deterioration of men's status and to reinforce a patriarchy, okay? Now I know you have a couple of outcomes in the paper where you look at sort of their behavioral responses or whether they have any kind of emotional, I forget exactly what the phrase is, but some sort of emotional response. But obviously, you know, those are not going to be great measures of what I'm describing here. You know, so I don't say this is a criticism of what you've done in the paper at all, but I would just love to see more openness to this idea of a channel and investigations of it empirically. So there is some evidence, some work on this in other social science branches, sociology and political science in particular, where they, have seen this kind of behavior in a lot of different contexts. Everything I was able to find, I'm not an expert in this area, so I can't say this is comprehensive, but everything I was able to find was theoretical. It would be really great to see some future work trying to empirically document the extent to which this channel exists. Okay, so my other small comments here, this is just a personal bugaboo, so maybe I'll skip it, but I think there are some controls for endogenous variables with education status and rural. I don't think that will change the results at all. My last thing I will say is that, you use an standardized index of the behavior of the intimate partner violence measures, which completely makes sense from an estimations point of view. But I do think it kind of conceals the gravity of the situation to have this standardized measure. So I would like to see, you have your 5 exhibits that you're limited to, but even in an appendix, how frequently people are experiencing, choking, humiliation, these kinds of things that are lost in a footnote, just to really, make salient the human toll that kind of gets lost with a standardized index, I think. But that's it. It's a wonderful paper, and I wish you a lot of luck with the revision process. It deserves a great outcome.
Thank you very much, Casey. Let's see, I think there's also some questions. Okay, so let me start with Casey's comments, maybe just reflect a bit. So no, I agree. I think, when we write instrumental violence, we try to actually include within that. So when we say men might use violence to take control of the decision-making power within the households, that's exactly that it can be an instrument for gaining control of decision-making power, for inserting men's power over women. Maybe within the language, it gets lost a little bit, but when we use instrumental violence, like we use it as not just for resource extraction, but also for instrument as a way of man's inserting authority in the household, in deciding key decisions within the household. We mean kind of in the way, in the reactive way that you described, but I think we can definitely make it more explicit, and thank you so much for that suggestion. For reporting as a potential mechanism, so we are limited with what is in the DHS. So I think that the most we could do there is, as you mentioned, the injuries index, which we think is more objective, but maybe we can try to see if there is anything else we could get at that point. In terms of, it is possible maybe that the endogenous control, so we can take them out and see if it changes anything. In terms of mobility from rural to urban, we did a check. We didn't see significant changes for this context. Let's see. Yeah, and in terms of, I think I agree with you, showing how much they experience it. So the rates in Cambodia are around 19%. So they're not crazy high as in Southeast Asia, but still fairly high. So definitely we could show those to explain what is the context in which this is happening. The reason we use index is to gain more power, because actually the domestic violence module is fairly small. I passed very quickly, I don't know if you could see, but we have only about 8,000 observations across 3 surveys. And when we use the district level variation, it's not a lot of power. Those are, I think, my comments too. And then I think I saw a question, let me see. Or maybe, where did I see that?
So Pinar has already answered a couple.
Oh, Pinar answered that one. Okay, because I think they asked if we can differentiate between men's versus women's employment, right? So we don't, I think maybe you wrote already, but we don't observe men's employment status in the DHS. We only observe occupation for this DHS for men. So it's a bit difficult to see exactly which one is driving the increase in IPV. I don't know, was it your answer? Maybe your answer was
I think the more general question is that can we tell the separate effects of now female employment increasing or male employment decreasing, the absolute versus the relative changes in the household income or employment. And no, unfortunately, we cannot say anything separately. They're happening at the same time. And I think biggest point is more specifically about that, whether we can say something about men who are losing their jobs and their spouses being more violated, but there is no such information in DHS.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Was there any other questions? I think that was it. Let me see. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Maybe if there aren't others, I have a quick one since we have a little bit of time. So I'm usually familiar with the backlash term being used for changes in women's economic situation. Is that your read as well, or does it apply sort of regardless of where the change happens?
Yes, I think that is correct. So I think the way we see backlash theories is we think of it as a sort of a more umbrella term that also includes the instrumental theories. And the idea being that generally it's the man being upset or threatened by either their own status deteriorating or the women's status increasing. So it's a relative change that's driving. And it could then lead to men acting on this, right? To try to gain their status back. They can use violence as a means of that, or they can just be emotionally upset and disturbed by the situation, and this emotional cues can trigger more violence. And in the opposite spectrum, I think we see the that it can also create incentives to extract resources.
Right.
Especially, I think, important in contexts where divorce is socially stigmatized.
Right.
So that's why we see more evidence of these backlash effects in developing countries, more so than developed countries. Although it is true that there is some evidence of bargaining theories sometimes in the developing countries too. It's not that there is a paper by Hidrobo in Ecuador. They support bargaining theories, but most papers that we know of that find empowerment effects for women than actually leading to backlash effects.
Right.
Yeah, and we think that this is mostly driven by, partly, if it's very hard for women to quit abusive relationships because divorce is very highly socially costly, then they're going to stick with it. And men know this. So it is then increasing their incentives to use violence for all sorts of these
right.
Motives, I think.
And maybe since we have 2 minutes, another question, if I may, and this is related to what Casey alluded to. So you argue the instrumental use of violence, but it's also consistent with what I would call an expressive use, it seems to me. And I guess my first question is that is that a correct interpretation? And secondly, is there anything that you could do to disentangle those things? Like, do you have private consumption, for example, anything in that direction?
Yeah, thank you so much. We are actually working on that now. We have one of the comments of the referees also was that they would like to know more about what happened to consumption and income, about household income. So in terms of, we have so far shown, I didn't have much time, but we have earnings measures as wages, and that is coming only from paid employment. But for the total income generated, we are trying to create a proxy, but I think consumption measures will be easier to generate. So we can see what happened to household consumption. I think we can see like different items of consumption, right? Things that man versus woman would consume, but we don't know exactly which item was consumed by whom. I think that information never exists, but I think Pinar was working on that recently.
Yeah, socioeconomic survey has the usual questions about the consumption items, but we cannot pin it down to a particular individual in the household.
Got it.
But, like, there's alcohol consumption versus, the children's education in the
Right.
very broad way.
But not like his clothing, her clothing.
No, no. I wish.
I think your work speaks to a lot disentangling to do better in that way, right? The experimental variation that Johannes has in one of his papers.
Yeah, but you know,
I'm a
that's
very
one
big fan.
setting and one study, yeah, small sample, and yeah. Great. Okay, so we're out of time. So let's move to the last paper, and that's presented by Hani. It's with a couple of co-authors, and it's titled Gender Differences in Political Career Progression Evidence from United States Elections. So Hani, please.
Hey, hi everyone, can you hear me okay? Thanks for Bilge for organizing, Johannes for chairing, and the IAFFE for hosting. This is a weird paper for this session, so thanks for including us and for sticking around. It's not about intimate partner violence, and it's not in a developing country, but hopefully you'll find it just as interesting. This is joint work with Ryan Brown, my colleague at U Denver, Steve O'Connell, who's at Emory, and James Reeves, who's a PhD student at the University of Michigan. So I don't have to tell this audience that women continue to be underrepresented in high status and leadership positions. And sorry, just a second. What did I do? Sorry about that. Give me 1 second. Okay. And that when we think about the underrepresentation of women in these high status positions, it's been well documented that it's partly related to a lower probability of promotions. There's a lot of theories and empirical evidence about why there might be a lower probability of promotion. Some of it is related to, for example, a higher probability of quitting. There's a lot of newer evidence about career interruptions due to having children. Discrimination and different behavioral aspects like preferences for competition and persistence. This gap in gender gap in political representation is particularly stark in politics, where despite the fact that we've made tremendous progress since the 70s, where essentially the share of women in the state legislatures or in Congress was essentially zero, we've seen quite a bit of an improvement. But you can see from this graph that even by the 2018 elections, the share of women in the state legislatures was a little bit below 25%, and it was still below 20% in Congress. This gender gap has been linked to a short supply of female candidates rather than female candidates running in elections but not winning. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence in political science that conditional on running, women has the same chance of winning, and they are even, they don't have any disadvantage in terms of raising funds. So when we think about the careers of politicians, it's natural to think about, the pipeline or kind of the stages through which a politician rises. And obviously, there are many paths through which a person can run or compete for a congressional seat. But participating and serving in the state legislatures is a particularly important pipeline, at least in the United States. For example, between 1976 and 2016, about 47% of the U.S. House of Representatives served as state legislators prior to serving in Congress. Now, this progression between the state legislature and Congress could be linear in the sense that they just jump from one body to the next body, and it could also include intermediate steps like serving in other intermediary positions. So the main research question in this paper is going to ask, does the state legislature pipeline to higher office functions equally for men and women? who are in politics, specifically whether there are gender differences in the relationship between state legislature service and competing for and winning congressional races. And then once we establish that such gender differences exist, we're going to try to understand what might be the mechanisms that are generating it. In terms of contribution to the literature, one way to think about what we're doing is that we're kind of following a bottom-up approach. So on the one hand, we are able to track the career progression of female and male politicians who, as I will explain to you when we get to the identification strategy, were quote unquote randomly selected to the same stage in the career ladder and serving in a very, very similar position. While typically when we look in the labor market, job assignments and promotions are endogenously determined and they're related to many factors that are very hard to disentangle. And also by following the progression from the bottom up, we are able to explicitly look at this leaky pipeline hypothesis in which women enter predominantly male occupations, but then they don't rise in the ranks of the job. When we think in contrast, when we think about what else exists in the literature, there's a lot that has been written about the role model effects. It's the idea that, when women run for Congress, maybe other women might want to run for Congress or for any other stage. This is typically something that's done at the same level of the hierarchy. There's also papers about differential experiences of women in politics. For example, papers in political science talking about the lower ambitions of women, which, in our context, we might think about as maybe endogenous to everything else that's going on. And also there's an increasing number of papers with conflicting evidence on the importance of diversifying, the kind of boards and upper management via quotas and their trickle effects on women, the rest of the company. So obviously, the main endogeneity problem here is that elections to the state legislature is related to both candidate characteristics, voter preferences, the type of constituencies and places they run in. So the way we're going to try and overcome that is we're going to compare the career trajectories of candidates who win or lose narrowly in a mixed gender state legislature election. So the main identification assumption in this case is going to be that women who win narrowly in a mixed gender state legislature election are going to be comparable on both observable and unobservables to women who lose such elections. And similarly, we're going to assume that men who win narrowly in such elections are going to be comparable to men who lose in such elections. Focusing on the mixed gender elections might seem weird, but it's not if you think about the fact that almost 85% of women compete against men. So this is really kind of an important feature of these types of elections. But also because focusing on the sample of mixed gender races yields equally electable candidates in otherwise similar elections. Although, as I will show you later on, including male elections doesn't really change the results very much. To think about the data, we use state legislature election returns going from 1967 to 2008, and we use congressional House and Senate elections, both the primaries and the general election returns from 1968 to 2016. The reason why there's a difference in the years at which each of these elections end is because we need to allow a gap to allow some people who are elected to the state legislature to actually have time to then run for Congress. And typically the average time between serving the state legislature and then competing for Congress is about 8 years, which kind of informed our choice here, although these choices can be varied and the results are robust to that. We then link candidates across different levels, across the different levels using a fuzzy name matching algorithm. And we identify mixed gender elections by comparing a candidate's first name to records from the Social Security and the census. Candidates can run multiple times, and they can also run multiple times in mixed gender elections. Our main sample includes or allows each candidate to be represented only once by the first mixed gender election that they participated in, although including candidates in multiple elections doesn't change the results either. we end up with a sample of about 16,000 mixed gender elections and about 25,000 candidates. So just to relieve some concerns about the comparability of these mixed gender elections compared to the kind of the overall sample of all elections, if we think about election characteristics in panel A and district characteristic and historical district characteristics in panel B, we don't really see a lot of differences. Really, the only difference you can see is in the margin of victory, but that's of course by construction, because our estimation sample is going to be a regression discontinuity estimation sample, where we're thinking about people who won or lost narrowly versus the overall sample, which includes everyone. And in panel C, when we look at the probabilities of running for higher office, you see that there's a simple difference between men and women that shows up in all of these categories. And it's very similar whether we focus on mixed gender election or whether we include all of the elections that we have. We also try to understand whether we're drawing these mixed gender elections from specific states by correlating the share of first-time mixed gender elections and the states they come from with the share of all elections and the states they come from. And you see that we have representation from across the country. We then go ahead and do some pretty standard RD checks, validity checks. First, the first thing we do, of course, is to check discontinuities in the density of the forcing variable, which in this case is the margin of victory. In panel A, we plot the distribution for the density for women. In panel B, we plot it for men, and you see that we don't see any kind of irregularities around the threshold of 0. We then also test for discontinuities in observables. Again, in the second column in this table, we compare the characteristics of women who won to women who lost. And in the third column, we compare the same characteristics for men who won compared to men who lose. And across all of these different characteristics, whether election, district, or candidate characteristics, we see very, very few differences, suggesting that the RD strategy is really getting us to a sample in which losers and winners by gender are comparable. The empirical strategy the empirical specification we're gonna estimate has the dependent variable is gonna be the probability of individual I in constituency C who was elected in state legislature year T as a function of them winning or losing narrowly. Of course, we're gonna include a linear function of the victory margin, which we allow to vary across each side of the discontinuity. And we include these control variables that I just showed you in the previous table to help us with with more precision. We include state legislature constituency fixed effects and state legislature election year fixed effects. We choose optimal bandwidth from Canonical, which I think is the standard, although the results are robust to choosing other bandwidths. And we cluster the standard errors by state. So let me start by showing you some graphical evidence for what we see. In the left side, we see the results for female candidates. And you see that there seems to be an advantage for serving the state legislature in the sense that women who win narrowly are more likely to run for Congress compared to women who lose narrowly. But this difference is relatively small and statistically insignificant. On the other hand, if you look at the right side of the panel, you see that the discontinuity is much larger for men and is statistically significant. If we take these graphs and simply put them in a table format, in panel A, we see that, for example, women who win have a 2.6 percentage point higher probability of running for Congress compared to a 7.4 percentage point higher probability for men to run for Congress. So there's a pretty large difference between them, and this difference is statistically significant at the 10%. We then go ahead and add a lot of these other controls kind of additively to see if they change anything, things like the legislative experience of the candidate, what party they belong to, the type of elections they are competing in, etc. And we don't really see that changes the estimates for either men or women. And we also do a global RD where we essentially include everyone, even those who are further away from the threshold, And that still generates a gender gap or a difference between the advantage of serving the state legislature for women compared to men. If we put these numbers kind of in some perspective, we see that relative to the means, they imply that the gender gap of about 4.8 percentage points imply that male legislators are twice as likely to run for Congress. And this is primarily driven by House primaries and general elections and not by running for the Senate. Does this translate to winning? The answer is yes. So unconditional on candidacy, we have a gender gap of about 4.6 percentage points between men and women, which is statistically significant in some outcomes, at least in column 1, and implies that men legislators or male legislators are 5 times as likely to win a congressional race. Now, remember that I told you at the beginning that women who run have the same probability of winning, but this is an important aspect here because this is unconditional on candidacy. Of course, then we find a big difference also in winning. The results are robust to the choice of the sample cutoff here, the varying bandwidths. We can focus only on men and women who compete for the first time. So they have kind of the exact same experience. That doesn't change anything, and including same gender elections in the sample. So what explains this? We have to be a little bit careful about thinking about this gender gap, because although the RDD strategy provides us with a causal estimate by gender, interpreting the estimated effects across gender requires a little bit more caution, because although women who win are comparable to women who lose, it's unclear that the marginal female winner is comparable to the marginal male winner. So you can think, for example, that male winners are just inherently more ambitious or more aggressive or whatever it is. They have more networks than women who win narrowly. So to try and understand a little bit what might knock down this gender gap, we examine whether the characteristics correlated with gender explain it. So what we show in this table in the second column, for example, is we compare the characteristics of women who win narrowly to men who win narrowly. And in column 3, we compare the characteristics of men who lose narrowly to women who lose narrowly. And again, in panel A and panel B, we don't really see any evidence that there are differences in the election or district characteristics that they run in, but we do see some differences, some important differences in candidate characteristics. For example, we see that women served fewer terms, they are less likely to be a sitting incumbent, they are more likely to be a first-time candidate, more likely to be a Democrat, and less likely to be a Republican. And we see basically the same patterns as we see for losers. So one question is whether essentially these things might explain the gender gap that we see. So what we do here in the first column in this table, we essentially reproduce the gender gap I showed you before, except we run it in an interactive models instead of running it separately for men and women. But that's exactly the 4.8 percentage points I talked about before. And then we start adding these correlates of gender by interacting it with the dummy of narrowly winning. We do this we add all of these correlates one by one until we get to the final column where we include them all together. But as you see, the estimated gender gap essentially doesn't budge, right? So all of these kind of observed characteristics about the woman that seems to be important, like experience, incumbency, party, doesn't seem to really change the gender gap or explain it much.
Hani, briefly, we're at time, so if you can wrap up soon.
Am I out of time? Okay.
Yeah, finish up.
Yeah. So let me just go ahead and say that we also showed some evidence that we don't see a lot of evidence that this is about time commitments and career family trade-offs by kind of doing different exercises, or for differences in kind of behavioral aspects like competition and persistence. The one thing we really get some leverage on is the environment of working with more men or less men. So it seems that women who are serving in state legislatures with a lot of men don't go and jump up in Congress, while women who work with a lot of other women are more encouraged to go up and run for Congress. And this is consistent with other evidence that the work environments and working with more men seems to not encourage women to kind of rise up in the hierarchy. That's it. I'll just finish here and let John discuss the paper.
Great. Thank you, Hani. So as a discussant, we have Jean Lafortune. Please, Jean.
Thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to discuss this paper. This was a very interesting work, although I will admit that I am not as familiar as I should be about the US political system. And one of my comment might be that, you know, the average reader might need a little bit more hand-holding explaining, you know, the career of a politician in the US. So just as a quick summary, you know, this paper compares the causal effect of being elected in state legislature on outcomes related to their political careers within the Congress, the US Congress, for men and women. Uses as an RD close races, and find that while winning increases the probability that a man goes on to run or win a congressional race, it does not do so for women. And I think, you know, Hani had to go very quickly, but he is, they're able to rule out a number of explanations. And I thought that that was very nice. So let me go, you know, directly to the meat of the comment. This one, I know you're doing a lot in the appendix. I would still prefer that your main specification would not be using mixed gender elections. This is usually the RD that we use when we want to know, you know, does it matter to have a man or a woman as a mayor, as a congressman, exact. But in your case, you're trying to instrument for being elected. And in that case, I'm not seeing much of a reason for doing this. And I'm particularly worried, you know, as you said before, that women in the literature, it is known that women are good at winning, right? So once they run, they're good at winning. But in your RD bunching test, you basically show that the distribution for women is very much centered to the left of the zero, which means that in your sample, the average woman loses. And so I'm a bit puzzled by the combination and whether it's because you focus on these mixed races that this happens. But anyway. And I do like the first ever election idea. I'm afraid that, you know, for some of the men in your sample, the first time they face a woman might be quite late in their career, and the women they face might be quite a young politician. So that might be, you know, you have differences, but that might be one that we are particularly worried about. The second is this picture that I, you know, it gave me quite a few ideas looking at this. And I want to say that, you know, you emphasize this difference, right? You say this is bigger for men than women. And it's true, but it's not that much bigger. What is also killing your effect is this, that for women, losing doesn't seem to be as bad as it is for men. And so, you know, my hypothesis, or the idea I would like to, you know, suggest is, you know, maybe for a man to lose against a woman in a tight race is really the end of their political career. For women to give a good run to an established politician, this might be, you know, quite a winner in terms of the party and the way that she'll be considered. So I'm, you know, I have a couple of ideas of how you can test this, but I think that that might be an alternative hypothesis to the one you are bringing in. My commentary is a bit unfair, but if there's any way you can get more data, I think, you know, it wasn't clear to me if moving on to the National Congress is the path of success for a politician. So, you know, are the wages way different? Is your influence on policies way bigger? There might be other types of political careers. Maybe you die, you know, your political career is more risky when you go to the national versus the state legislature. So a couple of things you could do here is you already show that they have a higher probability of running again in the same seat and in the same state. But is it true that the incumbent effect is bigger? So is it, you know, do they actually have a better chance of being elected if they stay in their home state than if they go to national as women compared to men? Could you code the state governor races? So, you know, maybe they choose to go through that path instead of the national arena. And I'm not sure anybody would say that you have more or less power being a state governor vis-a-vis a House representative, at least from my, you know, specialist view. I'm not sure about that. And, you know, could you run something like, are you in any elected position after 5 or 10 years within the one that you have coded to tell us if there is a difference there? Because I feel that that would be really what we would consider success for a politician, is that they're still, you know, active in politics within that amount of time. And then the last one is the channels. You know, you had to go very quickly in the presentation, but I basically think that you end up excluding everything except 2, which is the glass ceiling, and then something like self-selection due to preferences that are non-family related, because you managed to exclude that one, I think, really well. And that's, you know, frustrating, because every time we talk about discrimination, we're always stuck with these 2 options, you know, and so I'd like to see a little bit more at, you know, trying to dig into this. So can you look at how they behave in the state legislature? Do we have information of how they vote? How are their committees? What type of power do they get? Maybe they feel more powerful in that legislature than in the national one. Any information of funding? That's probably stretching it, but you know, that might be interesting. And then, you know, what I was saying before, are there simply a lack of good female candidates within some state legislature? And you know, if I lose, I'm still, you know, people are still want me on board. So could you interact, for example, you interpret the fact that they are part of very male dominated legislature as something of a negative experience. It could also be that in state legislature where there's very few women, parties will look at losers very positively and want to rerun them. And so you lose the gap between winner and losers more in those circumstances. And that's it. Overall, super interesting paper. And hopefully these comments can, you know, do something in terms of the next step of the paper.
Great. Johannes, do I have a few minutes to?
You do, yeah. Thank you, John. And yeah, Hani, you can run it however you like. We have like 3 minutes. It's going to kick us off abruptly at 1:45. So if you don't get a goodbye, then that's why.
Yeah, thanks, John. These are great comments. Some of them were echoed also by referees in the rejection we recently got. So great. I hope you weren't the referee. So in terms of the difference between men and women, you're right that the difference is not that big, you know, when you compare the discontinuities, but in fact you do it relative to the means, because the means are so different between men and women. The difference is actually quite substantial when you look at it that way. As for other paths for the career, we're actually in the process of collecting data on governors, exactly what you suggested, but I don't have results to report yet, because it turned out that, of course, collecting this data turned out to be much more difficult than we anticipated, but we're in the process, and I'm hoping we can add that to the paper as well. And you're right that it's hard to distinguish, you know, discrimination from other sources. But I just want to say about the losers and the winners, just because these discontinuities for losers look different, is that we follow the strategy that Melanie Wasserman applied, and we find that the effects are coming predominantly from the female winners and not from the female losers. So essentially, it's the winners who continue to run for Congress, and not the women who lose, which addresses some of the concerns you have. I think those are, given the time, I think those are the 3 big things that I wanted to say. But thanks a lot. You know, we're working on it, and hopefully next time some of your questions will be better addressed.
Okay, so I'm afraid we have to wrap up here. There's one question from Cecilia Conrad still in the Q&A, which maybe you can read before the meeting ends and then answer separately by email.
I will. Thanks, Cecilia. I will follow up with an email.
Great. But thank you so much, Bilge, for organizing the session, and to everyone for participating with papers and discussion, and to the attendees for participating as well.
Olga co-organized.
Yes, Bilge and Olga, sorry.
No worries.
Thank you.
Thank you.